It is a complicated account, tied to the origin of the Jewish nation. The story of a swindler and usurper who comes right for the love of a woman. Jacob, the second son of Isaac, the stealer of Esau's inheritance, had fled from the wrath of his brother to seek out refuge in the land of his mother's brother, Laban. While on the journey, he had an encounter with the God of his father and grandfather in a dream, and so swore an oath to worship him if, in time, he was reunited with his family. At the present, though, he was in need of a wife, and so, in due time and through circumstance, fell in love with the daughter of his uncle, Laban, a woman by the name of Rachel. To Jacob, she was so beautiful and wonderful that when Laban said that the young man would have to work 7 years for his hand in lieu of a dowry, he readily agreed. Yet when the time came for the two to be wed, the uncle substituted his younger daughter, Leah, in Rachel's place, a bit of treachery not discovered until after the wedding had taken place. When Jacob confronted his uncle, Laban placated him, saying that he could still have Rachel's hand were he to work an additional 7 years, something Jacob willingly did to have the woman that he loved. From this man, his 2 wives, and eventually their handmaidens, the Hebrew people would descend through the 12 patriarchs. Millennia later, a young boy in the German region of Swabia would read the account of Jacob's faithfulness in his Latin translation of the Old Testament's book of Genesis, and decide that if he should ever find a woman whom he wished to marry, he would take Jacob and Rachel as his role models. He made this pledge when he was 11, while living in the town of Leonberg, in what today would be called a very dysfunctional family. His father was a violent, ill-tempered man, prone to taking his frustrations out on his family, and his mother was unpleasant and quarrelsome, described by her neighbors as an ill-tempered shrew. The household was filled with anger and recrimination, and it would serve as a portent for the rest of the boy's life. As a refuge from the chaos of the life inflicted upon him by the outside world, he would seek respite in the life of the mind, and the contemplation of a God devoted to a harmonious universe. It would be this tension between a sought-after celestial harmony and an ever-present and real terrestrial disharmony that would define the life of Johannes Kepler.
Hello, and welcome to the Scientific Odyssey. The Scientific Odyssey is a many-part journey into the history and philosophy of science. My name is Chad Davies, and I'm the writer, host, and producer of the podcast, where we consider the ideas, processes, and results of over 2,500 years of scientific inquiry and discovery.
Series 3, Finding Our Place. Episode 19.1, Supplemental. Johannes Kepler, Searching for Harmony. As we begin our multi-part biography of Johannes Kepler, I should probably put my cards right out here on the table. Of all of the scientific figures I've read about and studied, there really is no one I admire and identify more with than this Swabian astronomer, mathematician, and man of faith. I don't know if it's his intellectual acumen across a broad range of fields, his noble character in the face of enormous pressure to conform to the intellectual and religious tides of his time, or the stoic and yet very human perseverance through crushing personal loss and adversity. But, like so many of his biographers, I find myself taken in by the life of this man some have called the first astrophysicist. With this in mind, I will try not to turn this into some sort of hagiography, a life of some kind of a scientific saint whose nearly superhuman qualities make him more of an object of veneration than one of emulation. To do that would not only be inaccurate, but I think that it would also rob you, my listener, of the chance to not only see the true genius of his mind, but also that there is, in each of us, the ability to do the same if we are really willing to do inquiry deeply and with great dedication. More than this, however, there's a toleration in the spirit of Johannes Kepler that is striking even today. The period he lived in was one of deep religious and intellectual strife. Here in recent weeks in the United States, the political and cultural rhetoric has reached what many have said is an unprecedented and fevered pitch. While those who have studied the political campaigns of the past would find much to take exception with in such a claim, it is unquestioned that the tenor of the conversation in the public square has become more heated than that at any time in the modern political era, at least here in the United States. Be that as it may, this overheated environment can't begin to hold a candle to that period at the end of the 16th century, where the forces of a splintering Reformation are doing battle both within its own ranks as well as with the rising Counter-Reformation. The heart of this conflict was not in Italy or England, but rather in Germany and Austria, the very places that Kepler would live his life. The theological, political, and cultural tensions of this time, focused in this fractured and contentious region, would form the enduring backdrop of Kepler's life, and after his death create a European civil war that would decimate Germany and break, once and for all, the Catholic Church's ambition to reassert religious uniformity and hegemony over the continent. All of that, though, was still in the future in 1572, when a young couple in the Swabian town of Wilderstadt welcomed into this world their first son. Heinrich and Katharina Kepler were each children of respectable families in that imperial free city. The father was descended from a line of warriors who had once served the Holy Roman Emperor well enough to be knighted on the bridge over the Tiber River in Rome when Charles V had sacked that city to remind the popes that there were times when the sword was mightier than all the papal bulls penned. The honor, however, was a heavy one to bear, and in time the family had renounced the title to turn to being tradesmen and political figures. Still, something of that ancient call to arms must have run in Heinrich's blood, as he was a restless and combative man who would, in time, heed the call to arms. His wife, Katharina, was a small, dark-skinned woman whose family were reasonably well-off innkeepers and burgermeisters. She was intelligent, insightful, and far too interested in everyone else's business. She practiced folk medicine, making herbal brews and potions in later life, sometimes to help with ailments, but more often to meddle in the love life of other people. Hers was a restless mind, constrained by culture and poor judgment, to have little to do but occupy itself with the gossip and intrigues of whatever town she lived in and whatever her neighbors were doing. It did not endear her to those around her, and in time it would come to have tragic consequences. The oldest son would take after his mother in so many ways. Johannes would be dark-complected and wiry. He would be frail in his youth and susceptible to disease and exhaustion. More than that, though, his mind, like hers, was active and sharp, and it seemed to never stop questioning. This would be the font of his encompassing scientific success and much of his personal misery. That Johannes Kepler lived through childhood to attain all of the success as an adult that he did was a near-run thing, an outcome not helped along by his father's restless and martial nature. When Johannes was but 3 years old, his father decided to improve his fortunes by joining one of the armies of the Low Countries as a mercenary, and was soon joined by his wife, who left Johannes and his younger brother in the care of relatives. During this time, Johannes contracted smallpox and nearly died. While spared from death, it may have been this disease that damaged his eyesight permanently. Additionally, the long-term effects of the infection may have weakened his constitution, thus making him more susceptible to illness throughout his life. In a few years, Johannes' father moved the family from the imperial city, renouncing his citizenship there for reasons left obscure by time. He moved into the predominantly Lutheran duchy of Württemberg that surrounded the city and settled in the small town of Leonberg, where a string of setbacks would befall him. It was during their first stay in Leonberg that Kepler's mother, in a rare display of affection and warmth towards her oldest son, took him to the top of a hill overlooking the town to view the comet of 1577, just as Tycho Brahe was first noticing it while walking to the small lake on Veen to fish for his dinner. Kepler would later write that he didn't remember much about the astronomical event, as his eyesight prevented him from seeing anything clearly. Instead, he recalled the warmth of sitting in his mother's lap and falling asleep there, something that was rare in his young life. This brief period of kindness was likely due to the fact that Kepler's father had once again left the family to pursue the fortunes of war in Belgium, but this time the expedition was a disaster. Perhaps the ill portent so many saw in the comet foretold what would befall Heinrich, as he lost what little money he had in the adventure and nearly ended up with his neck in a noose. When he did finally return to Leonberg, he announced that the family would have to sell the house and move to a rented property in a country village in Elmendingen. For 3 years, the family would live in poverty, doing agricultural work. During this time, Johannes was forced into back-breaking labor, ill-suited to his frail body, and his health suffered repeatedly from it. Just as excruciating for the young boy, the move and subsequent labor interrupted the one bright spot in an otherwise dismal existence, the haven that was school. It had been in Leonberg that Kepler first began his schooling in what was known as the German Schreibschule, where the students would learn to read and write German and learn just a bit of history and arithmetic. The instructors at the school, however, recognized that young Johannes wasn't the typical townsboy or country kid, but rather someone possessing a mind that was something entirely different. As he effortlessly mastered tasks that other children struggled with, they realized that his talent was being underdeveloped at the school, and so they recommended his transfer to the institution that had been founded by the Duchy to train intellectually talented youth for service to the Duke. Known as a Latin school, it had been developed to replace the monastery schools of the past in providing higher-level Lutheran education for the sons of the well-to-do or those few identified as being truly gifted. The 3-year curriculum there was designed to teach the students the ins and outs of medieval Latin in order to facilitate their entrance into the world of administration, religious life, or scholarship. Due to the 2 years of poverty that the Kepler family endured due to the bad judgment of Heinrich, Johannes would eventually end up taking 5 years to complete the curriculum, but finish it he did, overcoming obstacles that would have derailed many in his circumstances. In 1582, the family's fortunes had improved enough that they were able to once again acquire property in Leonsburg, and Johannes could resume his schooling. It is during this time that the episode of the introduction took place, with the boy reading from an Old Testament he was likely loaned by the Latin school. In 1584, at the age of 12, he would finish the curriculum there and take the comprehensive examination that marked its completion. It was a competitive exam, and he did so well on this test that he was given the opportunity to continue his education at a seminary school in the nearby town of Adelberg as a scholarship student, with his room and board paid for by the Duke of Württemberg. The Adelberg Seminary, again housed in a former Catholic monastery, was something of a religious boot camp, designed to indoctrinate its students in the theological argument of Luther's Reformation. And before we discuss some of Kepler's experiences there, I want to pause for just a minute to recognize just how different this is from what we experience today, at least here in the United States. Remember, Kepler's 12 years old when he enters the lower seminary, and he's likely 2 or 3 years older than many of his fellow students who had not had to take a 2 to 3 year break to do farm work. So important is fighting the theological battles that make up the core of the conflict between Catholicism and the Reformation, that the Reformers are beginning the process of serious religious education of those they think will be their clergy at age 8 to 10. Today, it is rare for someone to identify with a vocational path of this sort before their mid-teens, and there's almost no formal training for such a profession until college. The second thing that should be noted here is that at this point, Johannes Kepler has started down a path not to becoming a scholar or an astronomer or a mathematician, things he is known to history for, but rather to be a pastor. The end point of this particular journey is to occupy a pulpit and proclaim the gospel, or at least a Lutheran version of it, to the people. Finally, it is at this point historically that we have to begin saying Lutheran really instead of Protestant. The reason for this is that Protestantism has begun to fracture. In Geneva, Calvin has established a congregation of Protestants that do not agree with the Lutheran confession of the Christian faith and who hold different doctrinal beliefs, most notably on things like predestination and the sacrament of Eucharist. When Luther arrived at Heidelberg, he was soon made aware of these differences, but most of the formal instruction he received there can be considered an extension of the grammar-centered work of the Latin school. The day from this point on for a long time in his life would start at 4 a.m. in the summer and 5 a.m. in the winter, with prayer and chores, followed by classes and prescribed times of study. Every hour was laid out precisely for every student, dictating what would be done and how it would be done. Instruction was given by tutors, young seminarians who had recently graduated from the University of Tübingen's theological college known as the Stift. To the Latin being taught was added Greek and the other subjects of the trivium, rhetoric, dialectics, and music. Just prior to departing Leonberg for the seminary, Kepler had heard a local Lutheran preacher give what might be thought of as a fire and brimstone sermon condemning the beliefs and practices of the Calvinists in Geneva. The tenor and subject matter of the harangue so troubled Kepler that upon his arrival in Heidelberg, he wrote to Tübingen asking for printed versions of Luther's disputations so that he could consider the matter at length on his own. This shows us two things about Kepler at the time that would continue forth throughout his life. The first is his desire to work things through for himself and to reach his own conclusions. Just because some preacher said that this thing was true or that that thing happened didn't mean it actually was, at least for Luther. So, invariably, he would sit down and examine whatever the issue was from as many perspectives as he could and with as much charity towards each position as he could. This usually resulted in him coming to the conclusion that each side of an issue made good points and could be seen as honestly seeking to arrive at the truth. It doesn't take much imagination to recognize that such an approach would eventually land him in some pretty hot water down the road a ways, in a world where dogmatic positions were hardening into first animosity and eventually into atrocity. The second thing to recognize here is Kepler's intellectual seriousness and sensitivity. He wasn't really your typical kid, or probably more accurate for the time, your typical young man. He recognized the seriousness of the matters he considered, and he understood the importance of giving them the right thought that they deserved. He seems to have recognized that what was being discussed here wasn't something like the price of a cow or the ownership of a plot of land, but rather the fate of a human soul. And he wasn't about to condemn such a thing to eternal torment and suffering just because someone else did so from a lectern in a local church. In his work throughout his seminary training, Kepler's thinking is marked by an introspection and conscientiousness that went far beyond that of his peers. It would bring his work to the attention of his instructors who at every level commented on the excellence of his thought, the depth of his insight. This attitude, however, was also directed at an evaluation of his own person that is striking in both its honesty and its criticism. In his writings, we see numerous passages of self-commentary where he criticizes his own attitudes and behaviors in ways that just seem kind of over the top to the more mature reader. Basically, he spends a lot of time dogging himself for basically being a teenager and enjoying a few pranks and getting into arguments with his fellow students. It's like he can't cut himself any slack because he sees what the cultural ideal is, a person modeled after the figure of Jesus of Nazareth, and he can't seem to quite live up to that. He chides himself for engaging in quarrels and rivalries, for lacking self-control, for getting into arguments, for vowing to the pressure of authorities at one point so that he would become an informant on the activities of the young men in the seminaries, for not sticking to one topic long enough. The list just goes on and on. As I read of these recriminations, I find myself wanting to pull him aside and tell him that he's doing okay and just to lighten up a little bit, you know? Now, all of this is not to say that he was some sort of somber killjoy. Don't think of him as some sort of emo kid or some sort of emo trope where if he had had the tools, he would have dyed his hair black and wore eyeliner and painted his nails. Though, I have to say, it should be noted that in many of the portraits of him made later in his life, he does seem to dress in richly ornamented black clothing. Nor should we think of him as a sort of shrinking introvert who wanted nothing more than to remain in his cell and study theology. This was a guy who wanted to go out and preach the gospel to congregations full of people. Not exactly what you'd expect from someone who was a complete introvert, you know? In his time in the seminary, Kepler engaged in a wide variety of intellectual activities. He delighted in solving puzzles and then in finding newer and harder ones to work on. He practiced writing poetry in different meters that emulated the work of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and he got pretty good at it. He wrote in codes and anagrams, and he enjoyed constructing allegories that challenged the preconceived notions of his time and place. He learned the longest psalms by heart as a memory exercise. When he wrote copies of texts, whether they be religious or otherwise, he couldn't help but add his own thoughts and speculations in between the lines. Without question, his was an extraordinarily active mind that moved from one topic to another at a dizzying pace when allowed. As might be expected, it is also during this time that his religious disposition was formed. He was moderate in his pursuits whenever possible, but serious in following what he saw as the requirements of his faith. When he transgressed some point of conduct, he would assign himself penance, usually the reading of sermons and the considering of their message of repentance and rededication. However, as we have discussed, one should not mistake this for blind conformity. He felt it was his duty as a good Christian to learn and think for himself, and to do it from a fully informed position. He took to heart Luther's dictate that every man could interpret Scripture, but that he should do it only after having properly considered the writings of the great Christian tradition of faith. In time, this process would lead him to a place wherein he rejected Calvinism over the doctrine of predestination, but accepted the Calvinistic view of the Eucharist as having validity. In his conversations, he advocated for peace between the two factions of Protestantism, and even as he argued against the Catholic faith, he counseled charity as a road to peace rather than antagonism. Unfortunately, these conclusions would have very unfortunate consequences eventually. Kepler's theological training would progress through three distinct stages. The first, the lower seminary, took place in Heidelberg. The second, the upper seminary, occurred in a place called Maulbronn, to which he matriculated in 1584. Here, the students were introduced to the topics of the quadrivium, including spherics or geometry, and astronomy. From all accounts, he excelled in both, but not so much because of an interest in the subject per se, as had been the case with Tycho, but rather, it seems, because he loved the puzzle-like nature of the subjects. Doing proofs and applying models were engaging intellectual exercises that he did well at, even as he continued to master the theological ideas of the curriculum. In 2 years, he completed his work in Maulbronn and applied to attend the seminary school at the University of Tübingen. While he was accepted, since he was a scholarship student, he had to wait until a place opened up for him there, something that wasn't available right at that time. As such, he spent the third year as a veteran student, as it was called, at the upper seminary, and thus earned his BA degree by examination at the age of 16, and without having attended a single class at the university. The program at Tübingen, when he finally got there in 1588, consisted of 2 years studying in the arts curriculum before focusing on theological topics at the Stift. As was the case at all Protestant universities of the time, the curriculum was that created by Philip Melanchthon that emphasized a thorough grounding in all of the liberal arts before proceeding to the final stage of theological training. This Philippist curriculum, as it was known, was based on the idea that for a pastor to be able to adequately talk about the Creator, he must have a full grounding in all aspects of human knowledge regarding the creation. As before, Kepler attended as a scholarship student, with his room and board provided along with a small stipend for living expenses. Added to this was the proceeds from a small plot of land his grandfather in Wilderstadt owned. Eventually to that would be added a slight scholarship that would help cover all of his expenses. As was the case at Maulbronn and Heidelberg, Kepler was an excellent student, and again he demonstrated an excellent grasp of both mathematics and astronomy. In this, he benefited from meeting Michael Maestlin, the chair of mathematics at the school. Maestlin was a well-regarded scholar in Europe who was also a Copernican. While he faithfully taught the Ptolemaic model to his students, as was expected of him by the university, he was not afraid to share his Copernicanism with his better and more dedicated students. In time, Kepler would become convinced of the correctness of the Copernican model for reasons it behooves us to discuss now. As we've mentioned in previous episodes, one of the things that had come into the university curricula all across Europe after the fall of Constantinople in 1453 were the writings of a number of Greek philosophers other than Aristotle, including those of Plato and Pythagoras and his followers. These works emphasized a certain harmony in the world, and this emphasis on harmony had proven very attractive to the Latin mind. By the time of Kepler's education in the 1580s, such ideas were deeply integrated into the older Aristotelian material of scholasticism. As Kepler first encountered the Greek works of these philosophers, initially at Maulbronn and then more completely at Tübingen, he was deeply attracted to the idea of a harmonious creation. In many ways, he was no different from Tycho, who at that time, by the way, had just finished the construction of Uraniborg, a structure designed and built on these very same harmonious principles expressed through architecture. However, where Tycho saw his pursuit of harmony within a somewhat Grecified way, as a servant of Urania ferreting out the secrets of the heaven, Kepler saw these harmonies as a way to know and understand the mind and intention of God. This would be the driving belief that he would use to carry him throughout his life, and it would sustain him in some of the darkest times that he had to encounter. No matter how disharmonious the world would seem around him, whether that be in his own personal circumstances or in the religious and political conflicts that swirled around him and threatened to engulf him, Kepler would find a solid rudder in his life by seeking to uncover the harmonious order of God's creation. Interestingly, it would be Kepler and his focus on harmony that would later inspire the physicist and musician Werner Heisenberg. There is much in Heisenberg's writings that recall the ideas of harmony found in Kepler's writings, and it seems that, like Kepler, Heisenberg often found solace from the personal and political turmoil around him through the period of the two world wars. For Kepler, the years at the Stift would prove to be the happiest of his life in many ways. He was surrounded by a Protestant cocoon that allowed him to fully exercise his intellect both in the liberal arts and in the area of theology. He was able to pursue his ideas and excel along a well-marked out path that he understood and desired. He was financially stable and intellectually equipped to take full advantage of everything the university had to offer. Kepler's drive to find harmony and order in all things can be best illustrated by his conception of the Copernican system as he expressed it during this time in his life. In his picture, he conceived of the sun as being in the solar system like God the Father in the Trinitarian doctrine of Christianity. All things in creation revolved around the Father, just as in the solar system all things revolved around the sun. He saw the furthermost sphere of the stars as being like the person of God the Son in Christ as encompassing all of creation, enclosing and defining all space. Connecting these two were an infinite number of lines radiating outward from the sun to the outermost sphere that filled all of creation, and those lines represented the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit. Just as the three persons were united in community as one whole, so was the universe, which moved in a harmonious and ordered fashion as directed by these three persons or parts. Here we see Kepler's fundamental belief that the universe wasn't just some sort of a random thing. The creation was a result of profoundly hidden but deeply meaningful symmetries. All of the complexity seen in nature, Kepler believed, was the result of a set of understandable harmonies, and that these harmonies could be uncovered and understood by an inquiring mind. While science today takes this sort of thinking for granted, it should be understood just how revolutionary this line of thought was for its time. And as we will see, this analogy, while certainly rich in religious allegory, would prove even more useful in the development of Kepler's scientific thought in the future. In 1591, Kepler received his Master of Arts degree and began his study for his Masters of Theology. For 2 years, these went smoothly, at least from the view of the outside observer, as Kepler was still wrestling with doubts and conflicts that had arisen in the controversies surrounding the doctrines of the Lutherans and the Calvinists. One has to wonder what might have happened had he ever had the opportunity to step into a pulpit. That this did not happen is the result of events Kepler could not have seen coming. In 1594, the math teacher at the Protestant seminary in Graz, Styria, had passed away and the institution needed a replacement. As the headmaster of the school was a recent graduate of Tübingen, he sent a request to the university and the Stift to recommend a replacement. Kepler was in his third and final year of theological training, with all of his coursework more or less completed, when the faculty called him in to inform him that he had been chosen to fill this position. It's hard to explain just how big a shock this must have been to Kepler. The last 10 years of his short life had been spent preparing to become a pastor, and now his teachers were recommending that he step off of that path to become a mathematics teacher. While some historians have suggested that the assignment was a form of punishment either for holding unorthodox religious views or for promoting Copernicanism, Max Kaspar, author of what is probably the most respected biography of Kepler, disputes these explanations. He says there's no record of recrimination against Kepler for holding these views, and his work at the Stift was broadly praised by his instructors and generally the faculty there. The likely reason that Kepler was selected was that he was probably the best guy for the job, plain and simple. He was fairly rare in that he liked mathematics and was pretty good at it. The same thing probably couldn't be said for any of his classmates. Furthermore, as a scholarship student, his way had been paid by the duchy, and so there may have been a sense that he and his family would put up much less of a fuss about the appointment than the son of a nobleman or a large landholder might have. For Kepler's part, it is clear that he resisted going at first. However, he had sort of painted himself into a corner on the matter. He had written in the previous entry into one of his journals that he would not make the endless series of excuses of things not having been God's will or having a higher calling that he had seen many of his classmates make when they had been confronted with assignments they didn't like. In reflecting on this promise, he realized that he had written, quote, tougher than he actually was, end quote. After a bit of consultation with his family and wrangling over language of his appointment that would allow him to leave his post after a time and return to the Stift to finish his theological degree, Kepler packed his things and traveled to Graz. At this point, it's probably useful to talk about the province of Austria known as Styria and its capital Graz. Unlike Württemberg to the north, which was solidly Protestant, Styria was ruled by the Catholic Habsburg family. Under the Peace of Augsburg, that meant that the family had the right to force all of its subjects to convert to Catholicism or force them to leave the region. However, due to the large number of Protestant, powerful landholders in the region, especially around Graz, the Habsburg family had chosen a policy of religious tolerance. While not what we might think of as religious freedom, in that the state did actively promote Catholicism through repressive taxation and legal restriction on Protestants and their institutions, the Habsburg rulers did allow for churches and schools to be founded by followers of Luther and to be able to run mostly unmolested, a privilege, by the way, that was not extended to Calvinists. As part of the Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits had established a theological school in Graz in 1573. A year later, the Protestants did the same. The staff of the school consisted of a headmaster, 4 preachers, and 12 teachers, all possessing pretty strong theological training. Over time, as you might imagine, the school had become the center of Protestant activity in the region, and in 1594, Kepler was called to take the position of teaching mathematics and astronomy to the more advanced students of the school. Now, it turns out that while Kepler was well regarded by his colleagues, he wasn't probably the most engaging teacher, especially for young men, mostly from an agricultural background, that attended the school. His class was only sparsely attended during the first year and not at all in his second. As a result, he was assigned to teach other subjects such as rhetoric, poetry, and history, as well as lower-level arithmetic. In addition, he was also appointed as the district mathematician. While the position had a number of responsibilities associated with it, perhaps the most high-profile task was the creation of a yearly astrological calendar with associated predictions regarding the events for the coming year. It was a task that Kepler was pretty comfortable with. At Tübingen, he had gotten pretty good at astrology and at making predictions, mostly by turning his insight on the events around him and deducing what the likeliest set of outcomes would actually be. So when he made his first calendar, his first set of predictions in 1595 for that year into the winter of 1596, it turned out that his first attempt at the calendar, he did really pretty well. He predicted a number of events for 1595-1596 very accurately, including a brutally cold winter, a peasant uprising, and an invasion by the Turks to the south. As one might note, these 3 things, one following the other, isn't that big of a leap. Cold winters cause food shortages, which lead to civil unrest, which leads to opportunistic invasion by political rivals. Nevertheless, it established Kepler as a man of reputation throughout Styria, something that would become important fairly soon. A note is probably in order here about Kepler's astrological beliefs. He was chided by Maestlin for practicing astrology, and he himself is known to have called astrology the, quote, foolish little daughter of astronomy, end quote. He later wrote ruefully of, quote, nourishing the superstition of fatheads, end quote. Nevertheless, he understood that its practice was a routine part of the life of a mathematician, and he seems to have believed that there was some sort of a connection between the heavens and the realm of human events, though he thought that such an influence was small and could be overcome with the exercise of will. As he wrote in the 1598 edition of the calendar, quote, heaven cannot do much harm to the stronger of 2 enemies, nor help the weaker much. He who strengthens himself with good advice, with soldiers, with weapons, with courage, also brings heaven on his side. And if the stars are unfavorable to him, he conquers them and all misfortune, end quote. Now, it was during that year of 1595 that he makes his great discovery regarding the precession of the conjunction points of Jupiter and Saturn that we discussed in our episode titled The Harmony of the Worlds, that led to the publication of the Cosmographicum Mysterium. The polyhedral model he put forth there was a source of great encouragement for him and would establish him in the European astronomical community as a profoundly insightful thinker. There are, however, a few additional comments that should be made here. First, while the story of his initial insight makes him seem like, that revelation fell like a thunderbolt from Zeus, or maybe to put it in more Tychonic terms, a gift from Urania, the truth is that the realization was actually the outcome of several weeks' worth of hard work to master the material he was going to be teaching. When he learned that he was to teach mathematics in Graz, he realized that he had enough knowledge for himself, but maybe not enough knowledge to actually teach it. He didn't feel as if he'd understood the deeper connections between the various branches of mathematics and materials, and so he undertook a self-directed study to work through the material both in geometry and in astronomy. As a part of this, he continually asked the question, why did God do it this way? His fundamental belief was that there had to be a reason, an underlying harmony, as we said earlier, that drove him into the material in a way that most others had avoided. Moreover, it created in him a desire to see connections at a deeper level and to search for explanations for things that had long been taken for granted. As he had approached what was his revelation, he had focused down into sort of some fundamental questions. Things like, why were there 6 planets and only 6 planets in Copernicus's model? And what caused them to move in the way that they did? As a result of his sort of initial quote-unquote discovery and all of the work that came out after that, the book was his attempt to really answer those questions. And its publication in 1596 was the culmination at that time of his search for those answers. Now, not everybody was pleased with the approach taken in the book, especially with the idea that the sun created some sort of motive force to push the planets around. By the way, in this, we see Kepler attempting to break down that distinction between terrestrial physics in a way that was opposite of what Galileo was beginning to do just across the Alps. For Kepler, the goal was to apply the Aristotelian model of terrestrial motion, where a force was required to produce motion on Earth in the same way in the realm of the planets. In other words, for the planets to be able to move, the sun had to be producing some sort of a pushing force to push them around in their orbits. For those at the time steeped in the traditional picture of astronomy as a series of mathematical models that only explained what the motions of the heavens were, Kepler's attempt to combine that with physics were something of an affront. Maestlin, in a letter, would suggest that Kepler's efforts would, quote, lead to the ruin of astronomy, end quote. The publication process had begun in January of 1596, when Kepler's grandfathers in Wilderstadt had taken ill. He took leave of his position in Graz in February of that year and traveled to tend to them. As part of his leave, he visited Tübingen to visit with Maestlin and open negotiations with the printer. Required to get permission from the faculty of the university, Kepler was asked to make a couple of changes to the text, something that he did. The biggest one was just to rewrite parts of the book, just to make it a whole lot more understandable for the general reader. The book initially was a pretty mathematical thing. He also took the opportunity to visit Stuttgart, where he paid his respects to the Duke, who had funded his education and made possible his discoveries. He was allowed to dine with the Duke and sit at the table reserved for non-noble officials that were held in high regard by the Duke. It was about the highest honor someone in Kepler's station might have aspired to. Little did Kepler know that in time he would be meeting with emperors. As part of the visit, he discussed building a physical model of his polyhedral theory, something that would be worked on for several years in various forms, including the building of something like a 6-tiered punch bowl that would hold various beverages in the different orbital shapes ascribed to the different planets. To be honest, I really think that would be a pretty cool accoutrement at any modern party. I think it should be like required, hardware for any gathering of astronomers, Unfortunately, the project never produced a working model and would only serve to distract Kepler from other work in times when time was scarce. While all of this was very exciting, it did mean that his leave stretched from 2 months to 7, something his superiors at the school in Graz couldn't have been exactly happy with. Less happy, though, was one Jobst Müller, a prosperous mill owner in the city. Kepler had been courting his daughter Barbara and had asked for her hand in marriage, something the father somewhat grudgingly agreed to. It's not that Kepler was a poor match, but rather that his prospects were not as generous as Jobst would have liked. While being a teacher at the local shift school and the district mathematician was certainly respectable and honorable, it didn't exactly pay as well as Jobst would have liked. When Kepler disappeared, not for 2 months but 7, it seems that Müller decided that he could do better than the young astrologer who didn't seem to be taking this marriage thing very seriously. Publishing books on astronomical models might impress the professors at Tübingen, and even maybe the Duke of Württemberg, but it didn't matter much to the miller 2 hours by horse from Graz. It would take Kepler quite some time and the intervention of both the school and the church to finally persuade old Jobst that this man was the right guy for his twice-widowed daughter. What also seems to have soured the man to Kepler's advances was that Johannes took an enormous fondness to Barbara's daughter of a previous marriage. While nothing untoward happened between them, Kepler soon treated Regina as his own, something that may have well annoyed Grandpa Müller to no end. Nevertheless, in April of 1597, the two were wed, and soon the couple was expecting their first child. Shortly thereafter, the first copies of Kepler's book arrived from the printer, thus enhancing his reputation throughout the region and extending his network. We'll discuss that in greater detail in our next episode, as it will be important to understanding the relationship between Tycho and Kepler when the two finally meet. As will often be the case in Kepler's life, this moment of joy and tranquility would not last long. Before the end of 1597, his relationship with his father-in-law, not great to begin with, went south, likely over a combination of the usual sorts of marital dynamics, where the son-in-law is never quite good enough for the father's daughter, and Kepler's tendency to lash out and provoke anyone who treated him with contempt or mocked his work. In February of 1598, the first son of Johannes and Barbara was born, and in spite of the favorable horoscope cast by his father, baby Heinrich would die 2 months later. As Kepler wrote Maestlin, who had also recently lost a son, quote, "Time does not lessen my wife's grief, and this passage strikes at my heart. O vanity of vanities, and all is vanity." As horrible as all of this was, it was only part of what was taking place in Kepler's life. Religious tensions in Graz had been on the rise for a couple of years. In 1596, as Kepler had been returning from Swabia in Germany, a man by the name of Ferdinand had risen to become the Archduke of Inner Austria, which included Graz. Ferdinand had been taught and trained by the Jesuits to be a warrior for the Counter-Reformation, and the Protestants of Graz and the surrounding area worried that he might assert his rights as granted by the 1555 peace. For the first couple of years, things had gone reasonably well, but in the summer of 1598, Ferdinand had gone to Rome to meet with Pope Clement VIII. When he returned, he instituted the Counter-Reformation in earnest. Now, to say that all of this happened in a vacuum would be unfair. The Lutherans in and around Graz had for some time openly mocked their Catholic neighbors due to the belief that they held the upper hand in the balance of power. This led to retaliation on behalf of the Catholics. First, the passing over of Lutheran patients in the hospitals. Then higher taxes on Protestant things. And then finally, the outlawing of Lutheran sacraments in Graz itself. In response, the Lutherans appealed to Ferdinand in September of 1598 to stop the reprisals, but instead he closed all Lutheran institutions in the city. 10 days later, the Catholic archpresbyter banished all Lutheran ministers and teachers from the city with only a week's notice. When the Lutherans protested, Ferdinand upped the ante by saying that every one of these guys had to get out of town by nightfall. And none of those guys included the Keplers. And so they were forced to scramble to gather up what they could and get out of town or face death. In fact, of all of the people that had been banished from the town, only Kepler would be actually allowed to return. His position as district mathematician and his growing reputation and networking protected him, and he was allowed to return to his home in Graz. The episode, however, made it very clear to him that his position, as was the case for all Lutherans in the land controlled by Ferdinand, was precarious. Even as he returned, soldiers in the employ of Ferdinand went house to house, seizing Protestant writings, including Luther's translation of the Bible, and burning them as heretical. By most accounts, tens of thousands of volumes were consigned to the flames. In the light of the bonfires fueled by the writings he held most dear, Kepler came to the conclusion that he had to find employment elsewhere for his and his family's safety. As the world around him swirled in chaos once again, he began anew his search for a place where he could live harmoniously. In 2 years, that search would lead him to Prague and the very noisy household of Tycho Brahe. As we reach the end of this week's episode, let me say thanks for taking the time to listen. If you're enjoying this show, be sure to head over to whatever service you use to listen to the podcast and leave us a strong review. It helps us to get the word out and build a bigger crew. Also, if you haven't already subscribed to the show, be sure to do so you can receive the latest episodes when they are released. As you may have heard of this week, there have been a number of DNS attacks on various servers here on the East Coast, which sort of delays the updating of various social media sites and the like. Additionally, a number of the podcast catchers and site distributors like iTunes have had some difficulty updating their podcast episodes, including those with this show, so you don't always see the latest episodes of the show. So, if you want to avoid all of this, just subscribe and things will be delivered seamlessly to you without you having to keep checking to see if the latest update has appeared or the latest episode has shown up in your feed. Next week, we'll take an in-depth look at Kepler's involvement in the feud between Tycho and Ursus, and then the move to Prague. Until then, full sails on your journey.